Welcome to Clause 8, the voice of IP, hosted by Eli Mazur. First, some news. Clause 8 is joining IP Watchdog, the most interesting and influential media company focused on intellectual property and innovation. If you want to learn more about IP Watchdog, check out the previous episode with the founder, Gene Quinn. If you came across this podcast on IP Watchdog, welcome. Thank you for checking out this podcast, and please subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. Clause 8 is going to continue to feature long-form interviews, but there are also some other exciting plans in the works, so stay tuned. In the meantime, if you enjoy listening to this podcast, please share it with others and leave a 5-star rating. Finally, if you're not already a regular reader, check out IP Watchdog and sign up for their email list to get daily updates. This episode is the first part of our interview with Kevin Jakel, the founder and CEO of Unified Patents. Since the passage of the American Invents Act, Unified Patents has been focused on using AIA's new post-grant proceedings to challenge patents at the PTAB that are owned by so-called non-practicing entities, or patent trolls. This is an amazing story of rare and impressive innovation in the patent field. It is also a story about how the AIA allowed third parties that are not directly involved in a patent dispute to quote-unquote independently challenge patents at the PTAB. When Unified Patents is unsuccessful in challenging a patent at the PTAB, Unified Patents member companies are able to separately challenge the validity of the same patent again at the PTAB or in district court. This significantly increases the cost and difficulty of trying to enforce that patent, either because it wants to keep patent owners on edge, does not want to provide ammunition to those who question how independently it really operates from its members, or for some other reason, Unified Patents has not publicly disclosed how it decides what patents to target. This interview with Kevin tries to resolve some of that mystery surrounding Unified Patents. In this episode, we talk with Kevin about his career, what drove him to start Unified Patents, how Unified Patents came about, and try to get some clarity about how Unified Patents decides what patents to target. The next episode will be the second and final part of our interview with Kevin. That episode will cover some other aspects of how Unified Patents operates, Unified Patents' new program for targeting standard essential patents, the patent troll narrative, and various other patent policy issues.
Thank you so much for doing this, Kevin.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I guess the question that I'd like to start out with is, do you remember when you first heard about patents, and I guess what did you think about them at the time?
I guess my first exposure to patents goes all the way back to UCLA engineering and just basically on engineering projects, and the idea that I remember very clear that if I invented anything back then in the day in engineering school at UCLA, I had signed something at the time that UCLA would then own those patents.
Wow. As an undergrad?
Yeah, this was as an undergrad. I always thought that was pretty interesting and really fascinating. I didn't think anything much of it, and then kind of moved on, got my engineering degree, went to work building satellites for what was then TRW. And at that point, kind of got a little bit more interested in patents at the time, obviously in the context of being an engineer, working for a company. You invent things and you participate in the whole process of helping the company get IP.
And I guess probably when you were an engineer, but what did you think was the role of patents? Was it just something, just to get a nice certificate? Or I guess, did you give any thought to that at the time before you became an attorney?
Not really. As an engineer, you kind of have your head down a little bit. And some companies, I think, do a better job of explaining the overall higher level strategy of it. In particular, the area I was working in was building satellites basically for the government, classified programs and other things like this. Not a whole lot of competition among companies for that kind of work. It was probably more when I decided to go into law that I started learning a lot more about the strategic use of IP at that point.
So you went to, I guess, GW Law School, like myself, and then you did patent litigation. You were a patent examiner. Was that before or after law school?
That was before, and actually during law school, okay. So yeah.
So you did that, and then you worked as a patent litigation associate at various firms. I guess can you talk a little bit about what was your practice like? What kind of clients did you represent when you were a patent litigation associate?
Sure. So starting out, I actually did patent prosecution is what I started out on, like on day one. I did that for a year and a half, a little bit more maybe. In that front, I was working on all kinds of different technologies for a pretty wide range of clients at the time. ultimately made the transition at that point over to litigation. And at that time, I also moved from Howery over to K-Scholer. So the technology is really, as most patent attorneys will know, ranges from everything that comes in the door. So everything from electrical devices, mechanical devices a little bit. Got to work in the kind of the sports equipment arena on the patent front for a while. Litigation involving software patents and electrical devices. So mostly electrical engineering would be like the main focus of it, but that's it really does run the gamut.
Yeah. But did you represent patent owners or targets of patent troll litigation?
Sure. Yeah. The vast majority of what I did was represent defendants. In a few situations, we were basically representing companies in company-to-company litigation where one company was suing the other based on their IP for their own business reasons. The vast majority, however, was the alternative. We were mostly defending companies against NPE litigation. So a lot of small companies came in the door, and I would represent them basically in negotiations against NPEs at the time.
And this was, I guess, the mid to late 2000s, and there was a lot of already conversation of, I guess, quote-unquote patent trolls. Did you give any thought about that, I guess, it being a problem before you started doing that type of work, or did that really kind of shape your thinking in terms of the patent ecosystem, I guess?
I would say that, yeah, my view of the patent ecosystem has been shaped from every aspect of my career and every stage of it. But I also did some plaintiff's work during that same time as well. And one of the big things that you will see in patent litigation is just that the likelihood of patents ultimately being really valid and strong, good patents. Unfortunately, the sheer numbers are kind of against you. I mean, the quality of patents just are not very good. And in many cases, I was handling litigation where small companies had been sued and they would come to us. A fair amount of those clients came into us through patent prosecution and that type of work. When they came to us, they had no idea what was going on. They couldn't understand why it was that they were getting the letter, or they'd been brought into litigation but hadn't been served yet. And it's an awkward conversation because just the sheer cost of my going to work, depending on how much work they really wanted me to do. In many cases, you couldn't do a whole lot of work before you were going to spend more money on legal fees than you would spend if you just settled. So that was the pre-AIA days. And the fact of the matter was that companies, it was very inexpensive to add companies to a litigation at the time because of the way in which the rules for filing complaints were changed with the AIA, and all of that meant that in many ways small companies were added to large groups of defendants in a single complaint. And if you look back at those days, you would see tons of companies that would be settling out very early and for very low numbers. Mostly that was the process of building up a war chest and then using that money to then fund litigation against larger companies as the NPE litigation continued.
And I guess we'll get some of those aspects a little later. But after that, you moved on to become the head of litigation at Intuit. And I heard you talk about in that role, most of your work was 90% versus NPEs. Can you talk about how you ended up in that role? What was your work like being head of litigation at Intuit? And just, I guess, for the listeners, Intuit is a company that's really behind TurboTax and QuickBooks as a big software company related to, I guess, financial software.
My wife is also an attorney, and she made the choice to kind of go in-house. At the time, I was a litigation attorney working pretty long hours. Didn't really think much about going in-house until she kind of made that decision for herself. And we then together decided we were going to kind of get out of big law. And looking back on it, it was kind of a tough decision at the time. And I really didn't know anything else and was kind of too busy to put in the time to think about much else. Turned out to be the right choice for us personally. And so we actually ended up moving from Washington, D.C. out to kind of Silicon Valley. Went to work at Intuit as kind of head of IP litigation. And yes, I mean, it was pretty clear at the time. I was managing a docket that was 90% plus of NPE litigation. That's not only just the stuff that comes through district court, but demand letters and a bunch of licensing negotiations as well. Vast majority of all that activity turned out just to be NPE related.
Was it more of a nuisance for a company that I guess you could handle on your own, or what did it rise to the level where the CEO or maybe somebody under him was getting worried about all these lawsuits impacting the company?
I mean, it's a little bit of both. I mean, part of your job as an in-house attorney is to run interference for what issues need to be raised with management, which issues can be resolved without kind of additional distraction to the company. Yeah. So I would say that that's part of being a good in-house counsel, is learning how to manage the issues, how to see what you can resolve without being a distraction to management. And then learning which cases need to be brought up for actual conversation and what needs to be discussed with executive management.
Let's say if I talked to the CEO of Intuit at that time, is that something that he was, keeping him up at night, or is it kind of something that, you talked to him and then he moved on to something else? Or did, for example, even the general counsel even worry about, these small NPEs approaching in? It seems,
Sure. So obviously some of the conversations and the responses to those conversations were privileged, and I'm not going to dive into the details. But executive management was aware of NPE litigation. I can say that in many ways, I think this is not unusual. Lots of companies deal with NPE litigation by saying, if it doesn't breach a threshold of X number of dollars a year, then you're free to kind of just settle cases and get this stuff done without bothering anyone with it. So you do end up, trying to manage a bunch of the litigation without having to bring everything to management on that. The other aspect of it is, general counsel was clearly involved in a lot of this, partly because every time you go to a negotiation, you need authority to settle at some number or less. So you end up getting that authority to settle cases before you go into mediation. So depending on the size of that number of what you think that case is worth, in most cases, everyone from the GC to the CFO would be engaged in just about every, or at least aware of, going into every single mediation or discussion you're talking about in terms of settlement. So yeah, I mean, this NPE litigation definitely is a distraction for management. People definitely have to be involved, and part of that process is just the mechanisms through which companies have to give authority to attorneys to go out there and get deals like this done, settle that kind of litigation.
I mean, the time you were at Intuit, it was interesting. It was from 2009 to 2012, I believe. And really, this was when the debate over AIA was heating up. Intuit was a member of Coalition for Patent Fairness, which included a lot of big tech companies, such as Google, which some people think is largely responsible for the final bill. Did you have any involvement with the coalition, or can you tell us anything about those discussions that were related to AIA at the time?
So yes and no. I mean, we were a participant. We put our opinion out there. This was not something that we were the leading voice on this as much as other companies were. So I think that the AIA was a pretty significant piece of legislation. I personally don't think any one company really was responsible for it. And in fact, many of the drafters came from other industries besides tech. The formation of the PTAB, I think, in many ways was something that I think tech thought was a really good idea. But there's a bunch of other things in the AIA and a bunch of drafters of the AIA who come from pharma and other areas that a huge part of the AIA was bringing U.S. patent law into kind of harmony with the international community. So all of these things At the time, my time at Intuit, internally we were discussing what we thought was a good idea or not, and putting our voice in the mix in terms of our participation with industry groups. But in no way were we kind of the leading voice on the AIA.
And I think you touched upon it, but I mean, the reason why unified patents exists is because the AIA allows third parties, such as unified patents, to independently file IPRs to challenge patents. Do you remember any discussion around that? Was there any debate whether that should be the case or not should be the case, or was that kind of a given? If we're going to create PTAB, we're going to provide third parties with that?
No, actually the idea around unified and its like kind of current structure, actually I came up with that back before the AIA was put in place. Okay. So the idea for being able to have a third party create deterrence on behalf of tech areas, that actually was an inspiration I came up with based under the old inter-parties reexamination process. And by the way, that process works identically to the IPR process in terms of third parties could have filed inter-parties reexaminations in exactly the same way as third parties can file IPRs today.
It kind of was a coincidence that I guess unified patents I know you had this idea beforehand, but did the passage of AIA kind of spur the actual creation of the unified patents, or was that the timing was kind of a coincidence the way that came about?
I don't know. Certainly not coincidence in the sense that I was certainly aware of the bringing about the PTAB, and the fact that the shorter timeline to get an IPR to conclusion is something that I thought was particularly a good idea. Inter-parties reexaminations were great, and I filed them back in the day. But one of the problems with them is that when you put them in play, some of them were taking, actually most of them I think were taking 3 to 4 years to get completed. And in the interim, obviously NPE litigation would often either be on the same basic timeline or even faster than the process of filing and completing an inter-parties reexamination. So there were things about the proposed PTAB and what was going on that I thought were really good ideas, but these were things that I was looking for when I was managing this type of litigation. I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if there was a third party that was out doing something different than what is being done today, which was primarily just companies filing and defending litigation and RPX settling litigation. Like those were the only two options was fight or settle. And when you were settling, your only option was to do it yourself or use RPX. All of the settlements that were being done at the time all encouraged NPE activity, basically were there to influence more NPE litigation. It's a feedback loop. The more times you settle, the more likely it is that NPEs are going to take some of the profit, reinvest it, buy another patent, and do it all over again.
We'll talk about that more, but I guess I want to find out more about how unified patents came about. Shortly after, in 2014, you were on a panel with Keith Burgelt, and hopefully I'm not messing up his name too much, but he was the CEO of Open Invention Network, and he said, talking about your program and his program, that these aren't just some companies that come out by accident. They are well thought out, well designed, architected, and supported by dozens of large companies across the world. He said this. Do you think was that the story behind unified patents in terms of, did you have that kind of support when you started it, or was it really kind of your own idea?
Oh, no, this Open Innovation Network is a very different and had a very different beginning than unified patents. I started as a true startup. I had zero funding and zero support from anyone. So I left Intuit and my salary went to zero. Okay. And my beautiful wife supported me for the first year as I tried to get unified off the ground. So we had a very different beginning than OIN.
So it's not like, you were working with these big tech companies and they said, Kevin, you should go and start this thing. This was your own kind of
Yes, so I came up with the idea to do this. I started bouncing the idea off of friends and colleagues in the industry, and then I decided, if I'm going to give a go at this, then I need to just leave into it and see if I can make it work. So I did. I left into it, and at that point started just going around to everyone I knew, and asking if they liked the idea of a third party that would do something different for NPE activity than what RPX was doing at the time.
Did Intuit use RPX while you were head of patent litigation? On your website, and you expressed some misgivings about, I guess, their practices, I guess, in terms of deterring NPE litigation. So
I don't know if I would say that, but I don't think, yes. So I think I can probably say that Intuit did participate with RPX. So in terms of misgivings, I think that all kinds of companies settle with NPE litigation. Yeah. So settling with NPEs, including my own personal career, is a business reality for lots and lots of companies. And RPX settling litigation, I kind of view that as wholesale patent licensing purchasing, right? Yeah. They buy one license and then distribute it for dozens of companies, right, that care about that at basically a lower price than they could have possibly bought it themselves. Yeah. But ultimately, in aggregate, they turn a profit by that wholesale pricing model for a license. I don't think that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying that's bad. What I'm saying, though, is that NPEs are incentivized to go out, use some of the profit that they make from doing a deal, buy another patent, and sue the same companies all over again. Yeah. And that's true whether you're using RPX to settle litigation or doing it yourself. But RPX basically helps grease the wheels and helps get those deals done in a way that, in terms of the size of a deal, it makes a whole lot of sense for NPEs to do a deal like that. So this is just the ecosystem in which I was participating at the time, and I wanted something that would do the opposite, which was, hey, companies need someone to be out there making their most important products and services, like these technology areas, less likely to get sued again, because settlement doesn't do that. Yeah. That was the problem I wanted to try to solve, which was, how can we make key products and services less likely to be sued over and over and over again?
I guess I want to talk a little bit more about the startup story. So I guess Wall Street Journal reported, and you can correct them if this is wrong, but Google and NetApp were the first two members of Unified Patents. Can you tell them how you convinced them to kind of join your journey in terms of this battle versus NPEs?
Yeah, this is one of the unfortunate pieces of journalism that has come out, was that we had conversations with the journalists, because we were at that point, we hadn't really gone public with our model, and we had convinced some companies to join us, and they wanted to know who. So we told them who has signed up so far, and they referred to those companies in the article as founding Unified. We have made we called the guy up and we said, hey, that's not what happened, and that's not how. But he's like, I'm not gonna rewrite this article. It's out there. It's done. So anyway,
nice publicity, though, right?
We thought it'd be a good idea to get the journal to write about us. So that part was obvious. It just, anyway, we've been correcting that particular article for 6 years now. So no one besides myself founded Unified at the point of that particular article coming out. But by that time, we had found a couple companies that were interested in allowing us to go to work in our technology areas to try to deter NPE litigation. And so that's how that article kind of came about at the time.
And your co-founder at the time was Brian Hinman, who was working before that, I believe, at InterDigital, which some would refer to as NPE. How did you end up partnering up with him on Unified Patents?
Sure. Yeah. So Brian and I had known each other a little bit through just industry organizations. There were some colleagues of mine who were also colleagues of his, and they were aware of the fact that I was looking for kind of someone to kind of partner with on building Unified. And they were aware that I think he was looking to maybe try to do something different. Yeah. And then when we got together and started talking about ideas and how we could pull this forward, I think he was interested in kind of coming on board. He was with us with me, I guess, for 9-10 months or so. And then he got the opportunity to become head of IP at Philips, which he took that role. And I think he was happy in that role, and I'm glad that he took it.
What was your initial vision for the structure of Unified Patents? Did you think you would have your own large attorney staff? Did you think you would use outside law firms? What was your original vision for the structure, and how does that, I guess, compare to what ended up happening?
Going back that far, I'm not sure how much of the kind of the structure. Well, I certainly wasn't going to do it all myself, but the idea was absolutely on day one to be leveraging outside counsel to do a bunch of the initial work. The idea was always to kind of bring some of that work in-house and have a group of attorneys who were kind of IPR specialists who would be basically some of the best people in the country looking at validity and saying, okay, are good patents being used in litigation, or are kind of sub-quality bad patents being used in litigation? And if so, right, what are the mechanisms that we could bring to play to say, let's basically force everyone to kind of up their game so that everyone who's in the market or in the business of buying patents and monetizing them, if they up their game and only bring high quality patents, well then paying licenses for high quality patents and good stuff is not actually a problem, right? But they're harder to find. They're usually narrower and more specific. And so the model of kind of leveraging district court litigation on super broad patents to drive the value of licensing that patent up is something that I thought if we could basically deter the use of bad patents in that situation, we would ultimately have an impact on the overall NPE ecosystem.
Going back to that Wall Street Journal article, they also, I guess, interviewed the CEO of Acacia, which is a large NPE, and he said he wasn't very worried because they buy high quality patents. Did any part of you think, well, maybe he is right, maybe they are? I guess what was your reaction to?
My experience is that everyone says they're buying high quality patents, but the statistics simply don't lie. Yeah. Everything from statistics from district court litigation to the statistics coming out of the previous inter partes reexamination data to all of the data about the PTAB. Listen, as a former examiner, it's not an easy job to examine patents and always get it right. And especially when it comes to NPE litigation, where you're attempting to find a patent that you can use against a broad number of companies. The only patents that work really well for suing large groups of companies tend to be broad patents, which you can kind of stretch and push in the direction that you want. I think the statistics are what they are. I don't think it's terribly controversial to say that the quality of lots of patents that make it into litigation is not as high as everyone would like.
I guess we'll talk about some of those counter arguments later, but I want to talk more about the process that Unified Patents uses. It's obviously a very interesting company, but how do you decide what specific patents to target? I know you guys, track the litigation, you do your own patent analytics and so forth, but how do you decide this is the specific patent we're going to file an IPR against? Obviously, NPEs own hundreds of thousands of patents, so how do you decide which ones to go after?
Yeah, so we have a zone-by-zone approach to looking at everything that comes into the zone. So our process is we will look at patents that we see kind of come into the zone. So if a litigation is filed or demand letters or anything that we become aware of will be a patent that we would then internally take an opportunity to review. So we would look to see if we believe that patent is a threat to the zone, and we will then look to see if we think that by actually filing an IPR or working on that patent would generate a deterrence for the zone. So that is the kind of process that we go for. And if we think that patent is invalid and we start taking a look at it, then there's a whole bunch of assumptions that have to be met there. But if all of those assumptions are ultimately met, then we end up filing an IPR.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by will it create a deterrence to the zone? So I guess what are the factors that you look at to determining whether filing an IPR will or will not create a deterrence?
It's everything. I mean, this is just like our internal process is one where we look at everything that we possibly can about both the patent, its threat to the zone, its who owns it, everything that we can come across. We look at everything that has to do with that patent as a part of the process for filing an IPR.
So correct me if I'm wrong, I guess part of the process is you look at who owns it, if it's an NPE, if it's likely to be used to sue companies within that zone, and then you see if it's likely to be invalid, and then you file the IPR. Do I get the framework correctly in that?
No, not necessarily. I mean, every situation is going to be different. So we're going to be looking at, we take a zone-by-zone approach, right? Uh-huh. So we're going to be looking at it from basically the highest level and saying, okay, is this particular patent a good target for us? And we might come at each one of those individually to figure out why we think that would be a good target to go after.
I guess, can you describe a hypothetical scenario where you would decide when something would be a good target or not?
No, I mean, in terms of like going after a individual patent, we are going to it's an internal team process. So everyone on the team is involved, and we debate all of the various aspects of it. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't have a particular fact pattern that I'm gonna go through here today. I mean, this is something we do all the time. So what we look at, though, is, hey, do we think that this is a patent that's a threat to the zone? And then if we think that it is, right, then we will start working on it. There are lots of patents that we start working at and then we think are maybe valid. We end up not filing on them. So like the biggest gating factor for everything we do is kind of patent quality, and that process is something that if we don't think the patent is invalid, then we're not going to file an IPR.
Do you only target patents that are owned by NPEs, or is that a factor? Is that a screening factor that you consider for all of the patents?
Yeah, so we have NPE zones that we target. So absolutely. I mean, we are in the business of deterring NPE activity in our NPE zones. And so those NPE zones,
I guess some people might have, there's a lot of debate as what is considered an NPE, what is not considered an NPE. Is that something that you have to kind of, is that a determination that you make?
Yes, it's a determination we make.
I guess another question is, and obviously you have these, and you describe these zones, and companies can pay to become members of these different zones. I know you have all these side benefits, but in terms of the deterrence, what benefits does a member company get versus a non-member? Let's say, one company in the networking space is a member, the other one that's a competitor, that company is not. Do you track the litigation involved that member company is involved in, or anything like that?
No, I mean, we look at every single litigation that happens, and that's true for all companies, whether or not they are members or non-members. Every single patent litigation that is filed in the U.S. gets tracked by us. And the question is not who gets sued, but which zone that litigation falls into. So if it falls into a zone, then we're going to be looking at it to see if taking action will generate a deterrence activity for us. And if not, then we may or may not file an IPR. If it does look like we think we'll generate a deterrence activity from it, then we would kind of go to work to look to see if we think that patent is valid or not.
I guess another way to ask that question is, do you define the zone based on what member companies are part of it? I know you have, it's based on technology areas, but is that a factor that you look at?
No, the zones are technology based. So we come up with a definition of the technology, and then we have you can see it on our website. There's a definition of the technology, and those are not based on like what our members have. Like we try to define the technology area in order to size it such that we think we can go to work in that area, and one where we think we can create a deterrence for that technology area.